Hello, I'm Brian Canfield, and today we're going to further unravel the mysteries of stained glass. And in particular, we're going to talk about the restoration and preservation of stained glass. We happen to be in the field today at the Santa Margarita Ranch House on Camp Pendleton. We're here because we're actually going to work on and extract a stained glass artifact out of the chapel. But before we get into some of the specifics, I'd like to introduce my friend Faye Jonason. She's the museum officer. And Faye, where exactly are we? And give us a little history of the site.
Well, you're on the Rancho Santa Margarita National Historic Site. This includes the ranch house, the bunkhouse, and the chapel. The ranch house was built, first two rooms of it was built by the two Pico brothers. Pio was the last governor of Mexican California, and he and his brother did that first. And then they kind of had problems because it was the Mexican-American War, and so Pio Pico took off to save his life, and his brother fought the battle over at San Pascual. We include the ranch house as 1840 when they started the building. His brother-in-law came in from San Juan Capistrano, Don Juan Forster, and built the rest of the house pretty much as you see it today. The bunkhouse he also added around 1860. Now the chapel is much older. We believe it's the oldest building on the base. Early 1800s, we're not exactly sure what, but we do know that it was in the records that it was here. We believe it was a winery for the Mission San Luis Rey.
Okay.
And before that, we don't know that it was much more than a hut, maybe. We do have pictures of the vineyards out in the airfield, what is the airfield today, and we do have some information about its subsequent history.
And so when did the site become involved with the military as a base?
Well, in 1942, the Marines marched aboard base and took over the rancho under the War Powers Act, first of all, and then they finally got possession of it to keep it and paid $4.25 million for it. When they got this property, they got the chapel, of course, with it, and the Women Marines came aboard around that same time. When the Women Marines came aboard, this became Camp Pico, this particular piece of property, and they wanted a chapel. They didn't like having services in the brig any longer, and so they turned the building into a chapel from the blacksmith shop, which is what it was when the Marines came aboard base.
I see. So this was in the 40s, and the Women Marines spearheaded the chapel. So then the stained glass in particular, when do you think that those were installed?
Right away. I think they were right at the beginning because the letters that I have in file show 1940s. So maybe 1942, 43, 44, all during that time they were adding stained glass windows. The families were invited to contribute to the stained glass windows and have the windows in honor of their history association with the property. And so that's how we got those stained, and that was under General Fegan at the time.
Okay, so we've heard a little bit about the chapel. Can you tell us a little bit about the bunkhouse and what that might have been used for, and how do you use it today?
Well, the cowboys would have used the bunkhouse to live in. The rooms had bunk beds in them. They were rope beds.
Okay.
And this was luxury for them because out in the field they would sleep on the ground. So when they got to the bunkhouse, that was luxury. And they had just places to stay. There was a place for gear, I'm sure. And then there was a larger room that was for the mayor domo. He was more important than the other cowboys. He was in charge. But the Marines, when they came aboard base, turned it into a museum. They started collecting artifacts from the rancho and putting it in there. So that's what we have today.
So we've heard a little bit about the chapel and the bunkhouse. Now, what about the residence, and how is that used, and what is it used for today?
Well, it started out, like I said, with the first two rooms of the house being built by the Pico brothers. And then when the Mexican-American War took place, then the Pico brothers had other business. Andres was fighting the Americanos over in San Pascual, and Pio was running down to Mexico to hide. And so his brother-in-law paid off a gambling debt. Actually, this whole rancho was lost in a gambling debt. And so his brother-in-law was Don Juan Forster, who bought out the debt and moved with his family here from San Juan Capistrano. They expanded the house into what you see today, and they also built the bunkhouse. That continued until the fencing law around 1870. You were supposed to keep out the cattle out of everybody's crops, and so that was very costly to put those fences up. And there were other things that happened, droughts and so on. So the Forsters ended up having to sell the property to two businessmen in San Francisco, the O'Neills and the Floods. The Floods got their money out of the silver mine in Nevada, the Comstock lode, and the O'Neills were in the meat market business. So they ran the ranch, the Floods put up the money, the O'Neills lived here, and so they lived here up until the time that the Marines marched aboard base in '42. At that point, the base had some quandary as to what to use the house for. They actually had two Marines situated here to give people tours, to follow President Roosevelt's admonition that we should save the history here and show it off and tell people about it. So they had two Marines here for that purpose. And then after that, they said, well, you know, maybe we could use it for an officers' club. So around 1846, they turned the ranch house into an officers' club. That lasted, maybe less than a year. And then they decided, well, I guess what we should do is make it into an officers' quarters.
Okay.
So generals lived in this house from 1947 until 2007.
Wow, that's relatively recent.
Yes, it is.
And so now it's used as a living history museum.
Pretty much.
Okay.
There are events that take place still here by the generals, but yes.
Well, that's some fascinating history of this site. I really appreciate all the information that you gave us and your time as well, Faye.
Thank you.
Now we're going to go into the chapel and take a look at the stained glass artifact that we're going to extract, bring back to our studio to do some restoration work, and then once that's completed, we'll bring it back to the chapel and reinstall it. So now we're inside of the Adobe Chapel, and we're going to focus then on the restoration of the St. Michael window. This, we believe, is St. Michael based on the iconography. And as we mentioned earlier, these particular stained glass artifacts were put in circa 1940 and thereafter by what we've identified as the American Art Glass Company. And when you look down into the bottom of a lot of painted stained glass in particular, you'll find signatures and typically the dates, just like any other painted medium. Although a lot of times you may not find those names and signatures. This one in particular we're going to work on because it's facing the facade has a lot of sun exposure. It has a lot of heating and cooling throughout the years and days. And we believe that in conjunction with, of course, natural gravity, it's starting to bulge. And bulging is when you look at the surface of the particular stained glass and you'll notice that it isn't flat and it starts to move and you see curvatures. So what's happening is at the top, the weight of the window, and this one's approximately 3 feet by 3 feet thereof. And the weight of the window, of course, is the load is going down. There's nowhere for it to move towards the bottom of the window. Therefore, you get this bulging effect. Now, that's okay for a certain amount of time, and this particular stained glass has a pretty significant amount of rebar, which is cold pressed steel, about an 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, and it's perpendicular to the surface of the glass. Now, that's used to help distribute the load, but nonetheless gravity still affects the windows and it will still bulge. So when you look at the window, you have to evaluate at what level it's starting to move. Now over time, as it continues to bulge, the glass, of course, being flat, it's not going to curve, and eventually it's going to start to crack. If those cracks aren't addressed, then you're dealing with glass that's literally grinding against itself. And what that does then is it starts to shatter, and then of course it'll also start chipping off the fused on vitreous pigment that's painted on the surface of the glass. This could be an incredibly tedious process to restore something like this. The first step, however, is the most important, and that is extracting the window, and that's what we're actually going to go over today. It's relatively easy, but you have to be very patient and think about a lot of things along the way. First thing we want to think about is the existing framing. Typically, window or stained glass of this age is going to probably be put in with wood. And if that wood is old, it could be rotten. You would have to replace it and be very careful not to break it. Also, if there had been work done on it previously, you may find things like putty, you may find things like silicone that you have to address as well. So taking that window out, you have to be very careful not to twist it, keep it on a flat surface, because any odd pressure, you're just going to make the glass break even more than what has already been identified. So let's go ahead and take this stained glass out of its opening. Alright, now I'm just going to start moving it out. Take these, put the tap. This is where it's so critical, you don't want it to bend. There we go, released.